Welcome to the More Than English podcast, where we discuss fascinating and influential ideas, learning English along the way. Here we learn more than English.
I'm your host, Stephen. Welcome back, and today is the first episode discussing Hofstede's cultural dimensions. And today we're studying the first cultural dimension, which is power distance. The dimension of power distance addresses the fact that not all individuals within a society are equal. Even in countries which have a strong aptitude towards equality, it's simply a fact that it's not really possible for every single individual in a society to be completely equal. Of course, although in some countries the income inequality is less than others, still there is some inequality, right? In basically no country there is a situation where the boss and the subordinate earns exactly the same. But these inequalities, or this fact that there are differences in power between individuals in a society, is not just talking about income. There could be many things at hand here, which we'll talk about soon. Power distance is defined as the extent to which the less powerful individuals within a society accept or expect that power is distributed unevenly. The Power Distance Index, PDI, is a tool which is often used to put a numerical value on this concept. For example, today we will look at 3 or 4 countries and give you a score on this index and give some examples of why, according to the research and, some of my own anecdotes, why I think it's true that, for example, Russia is a high power distance country, and so on. Remember, as was said in the last episode, these indices are not to be used individually. That is to say, it's not enough to just get a score for Russia and to describe Russia knowing just this score, but rather it's to be used for comparison. Nevertheless, today I will give some examples of why it could be, why certain countries have certain scores, but that's not to say that that's enough to say why that they have this specific score. Maybe it's enough to give some examples to explain why they have a high score. Nevertheless, it's always good to note and remember that this is for comparison. It's also crucial to remember that power distance is not about the actual distance in power in a society or an organization, but rather the perception of it. So that is to say that if we have 2 companies which have the same organizational structure or hierarchy, that does not mean that their perception of the difference in power in the organization is the same. So we could have 2 countries or 2 companies which, let's say, they could have the same laws or rules or even unwritten rules, but that doesn't mean that they act the same way. So power distance is not just about looking at the laws or the rules within a society or an organization, but rather how people perceive these rules, how people perceive the distance in power. Of course, there's many examples we can give in a society when talking about, is it low power distance or high power distance? Organizations which are more hierarchical in structure, we can say are more high power distance. Whereas in low power distance organizations and societies, it's more common that, let's say, any employee can talk to any other employee. Maybe it's not common, but it's not like you are prohibited from speaking to the manager above your manager. Instead of a hierarchical structure, we can call this a flat organizational structure. And this is much more common nowadays in modern industries such as tech. In places like Google, if somebody has a grievance or maybe an idea, it's possible to get your word to the person who has the most power, right? Here, when I say the most power, it's more, let's say, official power. Let's say the person who is the CEO is officially the most powerful person, but the culture of the company is not that the CEO is the most powerful and we must listen to everything he or she says and do what they say and not to question them, but rather that's just a title. But really, we judge each other on merit and we judge each other on ideas, and there's a sense of openness that anyone can talk to or challenge other people. Regarding low power distance countries, In summary, we can say that your contribution to the work, to the world, speaks louder than your title. So let's give the example of a police officer talking with a person, a civilian in the street. Of course, the police officer has more power, right? At the end of the day, if they think that you're committing a crime or suspected of committing a crime, they have the right to take all your power away from you, right? But like we said, power distance is about the perception of the difference in power. So with this example, in a high power distance country, if a police officer is talking to a civilian, it's likely that the civilian will be very polite to the police officer and try to be very, let's say, calm and respectful, and to maybe not swear or not show that they maybe not get angry. Even if they're angry, maybe they will try to calm down. Okay, this police officer has a lot more power than me. If I'm angry, maybe he'll arrest me. So I'm gonna really calm down, try to be very respectful, and kind of accept that there is this big power distance. That might be common in a high power distance situation or country, right? Whereas in a low power distance country, a civilian might look at the police officer like any other human, like any other person, and not think, oh, they're a police officer, I must treat them in a different way because they are more powerful than me. But rather, let's say you have a grievance. Let's say somebody called the police because their neighbors are being noisy, they're having parties all night. And let's say they're angry because they had a party last week and they called them, but they did not solve the problem because now they're having a party again. So in a low power distance country, speaking to a police officer or who they see like any other human being, they might not be shy about showing how angry they are and maybe saying something like, you're not doing your job right, like I pay my taxes and it's not working, or something like that. In low power distance countries, because like we said, the expectation or acceptance of power distance is less. That means that civilians might be more willing to shout or get angry at police officers, and maybe even a bit disrespectful, or at least not be extra respectful more than they would be with a regular person. Because perhaps they don't expect that the police officers have real power over them. For example, it's not a crime in the UK to tell a police officer that is not doing a good job or that they need to do better. That unless maybe you're interfering with a crime that's happening right now, you won't get arrested, right? But in other countries, if you were shouting at a police officer or someone in authority, perhaps there would be more severe consequences. So even though, like we said, and once again, power distance is not the actual distance in power, but the perception. Of course, in countries where, let's say, the consequences for shouting at police officers is worse than in other countries, then it's likely that the perception will also be that you should respect the people, right? So, of course, there's a correlation that in countries where we can see it's like more clear that there's a power distance, there's probably also a perception of this power distance. But that's not to say that, for example, everywhere where there seems to be a big power distance, there's a high power distance index. And a great example for that is Israel, which we're going to talk about very soon. Before we start looking at some examples of nations and their respective power distance scores, let me give you a few concepts, a few terms, which can be related to power distance and why. The first is meritocracy. A meritocracy is a place, a society, where people value the skills and abilities and the performance of individuals. So, for example, the person gets the job because, as objectively as possible, the people interviewing them thought, wow, they are the most qualified, they are the most professional, they have the best references, they have the best CV, so we're going to hire them. That is to say that they don't get the job because their dad was the boss before or because of who they know otherwise. They don't get the job because of where they're from, what they look like, or even their race or gender or ethnicity. They get the job because they did the work, they performed the best, they're the most qualified. So in a low power distance country, for example, it's more common that the society in these organizations or just in society in general is based on a meritocracy. Whereas in high power distance countries, it's more common for things like nepotism, getting jobs or getting positions based on who you know, like having a family member in the business. Or things like age, maybe hiring the person who is 5 years older because you think they're more experienced and more professional, without actually looking deeply at what the two candidates have done. Another topic which is crucial when talking about power distance is government and corruption. In high power distance countries, typically, corruption is more common, and we have to say that the government system is more likely authoritative. So when talking about government and corruption, well, it makes sense that usually high power distance countries are more authoritative, right? Because that means that the civilians within a country, the citizens, have less expectations about what they can change if they disagree with something. And talking about corruption, citizens, even though they might hate that their country is corrupt, they accept it. They might say, this is just how it is here. We cannot do anything about it. So it's quite common that high power distance countries can be sometimes corrupt and often authoritarian. Another key concept is about accountability. Again, in low power distance countries, accountability is something crucial, and usually this means that if a leader makes a decision and messes up, let's say it's a bad decision, they are accountable for this problem. That is to say that the other people who maybe are not the manager but their subordinates can complain and can say, the leader messed up, we want a new leader, right? So accountability is very important in low power distance countries because the leader is not exempt from scrutiny. Whereas in high power distance countries, it's more common for leaders to kind of do what they want, and even if it messes up, they can come up with an excuse and nobody can really challenge their authority. Okay? So in low power distance countries, usually no leaders or managers are exempt from scrutiny. Whereas in high power distance countries, it's more common that leaders can do what they want and their authority is not challenged as much. And finally, when talking about government, we must mention centralization versus decentralization. Again, often in high power distance countries, they are more centralized. And we'll talk about this in the first example, the first national example, which will be Russia. On the other hand, in low power distance countries, the power is often decentralized. This could be to say, like we mentioned already, in organizations, instead of the manager, the boss making all the decisions and being the one who has to sign off on any important deals, in decentralized or more low power distance countries, in an organization, for example, even somebody who is not a key manager or has a really high position might have autonomy to make deals without referring to his superiors. And when talking about government, low power distance countries often don't have an extremely strong centralized government or centralized city. So Germany is a good example here. Germany has many cities which have specializations or are important and even could function on their own maybe. And for example, Berlin is the capital, it's the political center of Germany. And of course, it's the biggest in terms of population. So, it's definitely a capital city, it's definitely important. But then there's many other cities which are very important. Munich, for example, is a center for tech and industry and things like that. Frankfurt, on the other hand, only about 1 million people live there, but is quite a hub for finance and has the European Central Bank there, which is a big institution, of course, a part of the European Union. And then there's Hamburg, which is also quite a rich city, has a long history, and is the port capital of the country. It has a lot of key industries and has a lot of wealth. Hamburg is actually, as well as Munich, probably the two most expensive cities in Germany. Another layer to add to this concept is asymmetry. So that means that things are not equal, right? There's two sides, but they're not mirroring each other. They're not the same. So regarding power distance, asymmetry is a key concept because The degree to which there is asymmetry in a relationship can highlight high power distance instead of low power distance. So, for example, between a boss and an employee, when they are interacting, when they're communicating, if it's clear that there is an asymmetry here, if you can clearly tell who is the boss and who is the employee. If you look at a family, for example, is it clear that the parents are in charge and they make the rules and the kids are obeying them? Or does it look like more of a democracy within the family where the kids are able to give their opinion and say, I don't want to do that, daddy, I want to do something else, maybe the daddy will listen? Or does it look like what dad says goes? Respect is another key issue when talking about power distance. Typically in high power distance countries, respect is something you can have without doing anything to earn it. That is to say, for example, if you are an older person or speaking to somebody younger than you, then you expect them to show respect to you, or let's say an asymmetrical level of respect. It doesn't matter who that older person is, whether they are, a respectable member of society for things other than their age, but nevertheless, the young person should speak differently to them in a more formal way, in a more polite way, just because they are older than them. Or maybe, for example, in Asian cultures, this could be by bowing or doing something which shows that you not only respect them, but you understand that they are deserving of respect, right? You're a younger person, they're an older person, it's expected that maybe you bow to them or you bow lower than you would to a younger person. On the other hand, in low power distance countries, respect is often earned. That is to say that it's more of a meritocracy in low power distance countries, usually. So it doesn't really matter too much if somebody is, if there's two people, one is 40, one is 45. In many Western countries, which are usually more low power distance, this 5-year difference between 40 and 45 usually does not signify that the 40-year-old should respect the 45-year-old maybe more, or that their respect should be something to do with the fact that they are 5 years older. Of course, maybe this is the case if you're talking about a 20-year-old and a 70-year-old. Still, as in traditional, Western culture, we should respect our elders, right? But in, let's say, Asian countries like Korea, they take this to the next level. And that's to say, even somebody who is 18 and somebody who is 19, the 18-year-old is expected to show more respect or to speak more formally or something like that, more politely to the 19-year-old based on the fact that they are 1 year older. Another one is regarding welfare. So in low power distance countries, welfare is seen as something like a human right. Even the most disadvantaged people in the society should receive some welfare, should receive some help. And this help, should be given by everybody, but even maybe more so from the richer people in society who pay more taxes because they can afford it, which can help the people who don't have much money and can't afford it, right? So in low power distance countries, Scandinavian countries are a good example. They have a low power distance, and it's very common that their welfare system is highly developed, and everybody who needs it receives the welfare they need. And we could say this is because the culture does not accept or expect that there is just people who are in poverty and people who are really rich, but they fight against this inequality with the belief that everybody should have some level of power, and this power could be derived, for example, from having a stable income, even if you're out of work or disabled or have some difficulties. The family structure is another great example when talking about power distance. So in countries where there is a high power distance, it's common that children are meant to obey their parents and listen to what they say and not answer back. Again, giving the example of some Asian countries, children are supposed to respect and listen and obey their parents, right, most of the time. Maybe it's changing now, but traditionally we hear that kind of thing. For example, it's common that Asian students in the US often become doctors because their parents want them to become doctors, right? So something like this. And we can contribute this kind of obedience as having a high power distance culture. So even if an ABC, an American-born Chinese person, is in the US and maybe they kind of subscribe to US culture because they grew up there, they went to school there, but nevertheless in their family it's still a high power distance culture. So even though they hang out with, regular American kids and listen to AC/DC and skateboarding and do other American things and stuff like that, within their household, coming from let's say a Chinese background, there's still a culture, a high power distance culture, which makes it hard for children to, let's say, talk back to their parents, or it's ingrained within the family that if dad says something or mom says something, don't argue with them because you're not going to win, right? Whereas in low power distance countries or families which subscribe to more of a low power distance environment, it's more common for there to be a discourse, a discussion between different members of the family. That could be between the mother and father instead of one just deciding, or that could be between the parents and the children about what the rules should be, about what we should do today, about what's for dinner, about anything. So in your family, how was it? Could you talk back to your parents? Did they ask you where you wanted to go and what you wanted to eat for dinner? Or did they tell you, come down at 6 p.m., dinner will be ready, don't be late? Let me know.
Thank you for listening and/or watching this episode. Today we covered many key principles associated with power distance. And now I would like to summarize them for you. Instead of saying low power distance country, high power distance country, I will just say low or high to make it easier. Regarding organizational structures, hierarchies are more high, whereas flat organizational structures are more low. Meritocracies are more low, whereas nepotism is high. Corruption is usually high, whereas accountability for managers and leaders is low. Centralisation is high, whereas decentralisation is low. Asymmetry and respect, especially for older people, is high, whereas welfare, especially as a human right, is low. And finally, the family structure is a great example to see whether in your household there is more of a high or low power distance culture. Next lesson, we're going to look at 3 national examples for power distance, which will be Russia, Israel, and Japan. Stay tuned for that. And finally, here's today's key vocabulary, page 1. Aptitude, a natural ability or skill. Subordinate, having a lower or less important position. To be at hand, closely involved or close in time or space. Anecdote, a short and often funny personal story. Meritocracy, a place where people are valued only on their skills and abilities. Nepotism, the act of unfairly giving job opportunities to family or friends. Authoritative, being commanding and often demanding obedience. Accountability, being responsible for your actions and the consequences. Page 2. Exempt from scrutiny, having special permission in order not to be closely examined. Centralisation and decentralisation, the extent to which power and control is focused in one place. To sign off on something, to approve something officially. Autonomy, the freedom to make independent decisions. Superior, higher in rank or status, the opposite of subordinate. Asymmetry, the condition of two people or things not being equal. Derived, coming from or caused by something else. And finally, ingrained, believe in something so strongly that it is unlikely to change. Thanks guys, see you next time.